Welcome back to another Just 5 Mins, and following along, if I can get the words out today, of the Docker WASM, which is Docker WebAssembly, meaning that it can run the performance increase, how small the containers are. It's following along from that, but something that jumped out, and it sort of piqued my interest because it's basically saying about using WebAssembly more outside of the browser. So WebAssembly, for those don't know about it, I'll put a link in the show notes, but Blazor is one of the, on the Microsoft world anyway, is one of the big success stories where it's using essentially compiled .NET in this case in the browser, but you're not limited to just .NET. There's everything, or it seems to be anyway, that can run in there. Anyway, the bottom line is that technology, the WebAssembly, or WASM as it's lovely named, can now be, it's starting to run outside of the browser, and more importantly on the server as well, which is really interesting. I don't fully understand this yet. I'm really delving into it, but it's really got my attention since I started to read about the Docker WebAssembly push, even though it's in a very early sort of alpha beta stage at the moment. But there's a company called Fermyon. Again, I'll pop the links below, and this one will jump out to a good friend of mine, Tim, because it's all rusty again. It's all getting very rusty. Should use some WD-40, but anyway, but I believe, although I'm not 100% sure, but it looks like from looking at the Git repository, it's all Rust, essentially, this. And what we're talking about is essentially Fermyon have built a WebAssembly cloud to push serverless microservices beyond containers. There you go. So the idea is, again, rather than it using the Docker sort of process, if you like, with images, containers running and all that sort of stuff, it's like almost a lower level than that. And of course, it's more compact, it's obviously smaller, it seems to have a massive performance boost as well. But again, I'm delving into this for the first time in this last couple of days. But interestingly, the company Fermyon, it's quite interesting actually. They've created something called Spin, which basically is a framework for building and running event-driven microservice applications with WebAssembly, or WASM, and so that looks interesting on its own. Okay, so again, it's a cloud-based, but I don't think you're forced into using Rust or Go or things like that. There are other languages that you can use, including C#, I believe, but I think it's sort of like in beta for that language. Anyway, but the key bit is that they've also got again, as the previous point mentioned, about a cloud version. Okay, so I'm just wondering where this is all going, obviously, because you've got Docker WASM, so they're going that way. And apparently underneath all of this is something called WASI. So we've got WASM and WASI, WASI, which again, I've got a couple of links, but basically it's a modular system interface for WebAssembly. Okay, there's links. I'm not even going to try to explain it right now because it's melting my brain. But the Fermyon cloud and Fermyon in general, it's quite an interesting thing what they're doing. And I think it's definitely worth a look, and certainly with Docker going, or at least starting to offer, or possibly offer, Docker with WASM, because they can get that reduction in size, increased performance, everything else. I think it's personally a really interesting time, and certainly with this, I'm sure they're not going to be the only people doing it, but it really did jump out. I haven't had a chance to try it yet. This is the Fermyon cloud, but it's worth a look at. and certainly if you're in a rusty environment, should we say, I think it's probably going to be even more interesting for you. I just think it's, like I say, it's an interesting time where this might be going for things like microservices, or generally what you would consider a container, and pushing those bounds with things like the WebAssembly. Good old, I've forgotten his last name, Steve. Lost his last name. Sorry, Steve. Who created Blazor, essentially. That really took advantage of that WebAssembly in the browser. It's now starting to, bleed into the server side, and some amazing use cases like this coming up. So that's what I've got for this time. It's worth a read, even just looking at what they're doing with this sort of stuff. So it may be a little while before it reaches maybe mainstream, or maybe people would argue it already is. But either way, it's certainly a good one to have a look at for this time around. So that's what I've got. We'll catch you on the next one.